security establishment to look past a long list of transgressions and abuses and actually embrace Russia. Let's begin with the initial questions. Professor Cohen, I'd like to start with you. You've spoken and written a good deal in recent years about the justifications for Russia's behavior in Ukraine and Crimea and elsewhere, and you've suggested it's U.S. and Western provocation at least as much as, if not more than, Russian action that has brought us to what you've described now as a new Cold War. So let me ask you, what is Vladimir Putin after? How does he intend to achieve his goals? And what do you see as the prospect of U.S.-Russian cooperation?
We got sound, right?
Yes.
You have 30 seconds to answer that.
Oh, 30?
No.
Yes, no, and maybe. So I'm here, obviously, as the outlier. Some of you may know me as Putin's best friend in America or Putin's apologist. It's not true, but I think it necessary to remember which of us is the Cohen up here and who prevails in tribal authority. And I may evoke that as we go on. I also want to say, to establish my credentials, that I alone, perhaps, was bar mitzvahed in a small Kentucky town on the Ohio River in a tiny temple founded by Stephen Weiss himself. We had no rabbi, but the rabbi came all the way from the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati just to bar mitzvah me. I didn't want to be bar mitzvahed as the only Jew in town, but my father said I had to because he's coming from Cincinnati on a raft, and it was very dangerous. Later I learned he came on the train like everybody else. So I have some kosher credentials. Let me answer your question by just generally stating my position, because it relates to your question and to what was said before by Stephen. Correct, Steve? I obviously do not agree fully with what Steve said. And it's important to have a discussion in this day, and the broader the better. Let me make my three heresies as a Cohen clear. We're in a new and more dangerous Cold War. This is a history that began probably with the end of the Soviet Union. It's much more dangerous than the preceding one. And I believe that if we assign responsibility in terms of policy, the United States is probably somewhere in the area of 80% responsible. And Russia's unwise reaction to us about 20%. I don't know if you can quantify these things, but just for the sake of argument. The second point is that in the world in which we live, and today I'm thinking about terrorism, as we all are, whoever's in the Kremlin is our most natural national security partner, essential. But we ruled that out in the terms of Putin. I come to Putin now, because we vilified and demonized him in a way that we can't think clearly about him. By the way, Oliver Stone's 4 hours of interviews with Putin, more than I think any interviewer's ever had for film, begins on Showtime, I think, next week. And so we can watch Putin for 4 hours and see if anything he says or does changes our mind. But part of the problem is that we've so demonized him, we can't say, is he a national security partner in the way that Eisenhower thought Khrushchev was, Nixon thought Brezhnev was, Reagan thought Gorbachev was. And the final point I would make is that we have now an additional problem. For many people, the combination of Putin and Trump is simply toxic beyond any rational discussion. So when we have Trump in the White House and Putin in the Kremlin, and I didn't put Trump in the White House and I didn't put Putin in the Kremlin, and yet I think that cooperation, above all on terrorism, is imperative. And I think this thing called Russiagate, which I personally think there's almost nothing to, has become an obstacle to any serious diplomatic negotiations, though they're obviously trying, that we really have a very serious, maybe existential problem. And that's where I stand on the Putin question and what we should do.
And the question about what he is after?
Well, I'm a historian, and also I wrote biography. When a person comes to power and has been in power 16 years or even less, their goals change. So I know what his mission was when he came to power in 2000. Russia was a state that had collapsed twice in the 20th century. There's no precedent for this in the revolution and again 1991. So his mission was to restore a stable Russia that would never again collapse. Now, he has different missions, but I would say the minimum goal is he wants absolutely no military bases on Russia's borders. And I would go on to say that's not unreasonable. We wouldn't tolerate it either. We had the Monroe Doctrine. We'd go ballistic if a Chinese-Russian alliance appeared in Mexico or Canada. That's his minimum goal, I would say. Then he begins to negotiate. I don't find him an aberrant or unusual in Russia's tradition leader. 20th century, I mean, he obviously wants a prosperous Russia, a high-tech Russia, a well-educated Russia, a Russia that is a world power. Let me end with this. Stop and think. All of us can remember 3 years ago. In the 90s, a very prominent, I won't mention his name, Washington figure wrote that we live in a world without Russia. It was Tom Graham. Big famous article, remember that? That Russia didn't matter anymore. Then we got to 2014 and Obama said Russia was merely a regional power. Then after Ukraine, we said Russia's a threat to Europe. And now we're saying Russia hijacked our democracy. And now we have McCain and others saying Russia's a greater threat than ISIS. So Russia has gone from the 90s of zero consequence to us to back where it was in my old Cold War. Am I the oldest person in the room? Maybe not. You all remember this. To this #1 existential threat. Is that all because of Putin? Or have we done something? Have we changed our thinking? Have we provoked something that's not good for the world? So Putin evolves with the world.
Thank you, Steve. Julia? Professor, can Washington and Moscow cooperate in the way that you've urged in the past without lifting the U.S. sanctions against Russia? And do you see those sanctions being lifted in the absence of Russian withdrawal from eastern Ukraine and Crimea, which is even remotely possible?
They can cooperate, and the sanctions, the American sanctions are symbolic, they don't matter. It's the European sanctions that matter. Let me remind you that Jackson Vanik, you all know what Jackson Vanik was? Sure. Right? Yeah, I'd said that the Soviet Union could not trade with the United States on favorable terms until they let the Jews go. That stayed on the books after the end of the Soviet Union, and when more Jews were going to Russia than were leaving. So once you get these sanctions, which are easy to put on and politically feel good and become political balls in a game, it's very hard to remove them. The American sanctions, except the foolish thing that Obama did at the end, in illegally seizing property. Those compounds are private Russian property, and we've got 2 in Russia, and the Russians say, give them back or we'll take yours, and threatening a cyber attack against Russia, which was reckless. Let's leave all that aside. For me, if we're going to talk about what seems to me to be the #1 threat to all of us and our kids, and not only us, international terrorism, the détente between Julia and myself, which was very short-lived but remarkable. I was going to say if Julia Joffe and Stephen Cohen can have a détente, surely Trump and Putin can sort it out, and they should just send the 2 of us to do the work for them, but it didn't quite work out. There's a fundamental issue here, and I think Andrew and Julia represent the prevailing Washington mainstream view, which I think is empirically, conceptually, fundamentally wrong, and this has to do with our security. We can't have, they say, a counterterrorism or anti-terrorism alliance with Russia because Russia doesn't really fight terrorism in Syria. It just went to keep Assad in power. That's a conceptual misunderstanding. They also say that we can't do it because the CIA and DOD are against it. And we know this to be true. About this, it's correct. We know in 2016, we know this is a fact. Leave aside the 51 diplomats who broke all precedent at the State Department and came out and publicly protested Obama negotiating with Putin for some cooperation in Syria. You recall that episode? No precedent for it in American history, I know. And then, when Obama and Putin agree on a limited intelligence sharing in Syria, DOD violated the arrangements by killing 80 Syrian soldiers and sabotaged it. And the CIA has been leaking since July 2016 against Trump. Why, I don't know, but one guess is they don't like Trump's idea. Wouldn't it be great to cooperate with Russia? So we know there's this opposition, and that's why we have political leaderships. Let me remind you of a little history. Every major détente we've had has been conducted by a Republican president. Eisenhower, Nixon, and Reagan. And if any of you were around when Reagan, quote, betrayed his Cold War history and met Gorbachev halfway, his own Secretary of State, Caspar Weinberger, said, I quit. Were you around? You remember that one, Cappy? And we remember what Reagan said? Cappy, we're going to miss you around here. Because Reagan had made up his mind and he went forward. So there is powerful opposition. And there's opposition in Moscow to this arrangement, too, I agree. Leaders do. Here's the fundamental question. And Putin told this to Megyn Kelly last night, but she didn't have the slightest idea what he was talking about. She did this kind of interview. She was going to a question. She didn't hear the answers. There was no real follow-up. And so she didn't really interrogate him about fundamental questions.
Well, he's not easy to interrogate.
Yes, he is. He's very discussione. He talks, he watches, he answers questions. You know, maybe don't agree, but he gives his answer. Here's the Russian point of view, and it's not just Putin, but it's the Russian security class, and I find it compelling. The terrorism we're dealing with today is not your grandfather's or your father's terrorism. It's not those lone terrorists who killed Russian czars. It's not the Jews who killed the British in Palestine. It's not the cuckoo who goes out and kills. This is organized terrorism. They control territories. They have aspects of statehood. They have bank accounts. They have resources. They have infrastructure. They have an ideology that gives them boundless recruits. This is something new. The primary risk is when the state collapses in a place like the Middle East, as happened in Iraq, as happened in Libya. And it's even worse when the United States decides it's going to decapitate those states. And then you give these terrorists territory, recruits, oil, resources. For 3 years prior to when Putin decided to intervene in Syria in September 2015, Obama said he was fighting ISIS. Go back and look at those 3 years. All ISIS did was take more territory in Iraq and Syria. That's a fact. We were not fighting anybody except the foes of Assad. And we got testimony from the CIA in front of Congress. One guy finally said for $500 million or $1 billion, he thought there were 5 people there fighting. They were funding people who couldn't fight anybody, who had aims that were not consistent with anti-terrorism, some of which were terrorists themselves, al-Qaeda derivatives. So Putin's argument is this. And he said this to Obama publicly, and he said it to the UN twice, and he says it all the time. You, Andrew and Julia, tell me, decapitate the Syrian state, and what do you imagine? And I tell you, you have an existential choice. It is either Assad in Damascus, or it's the Islamic State. At the moment, if we don't have the Syrian army, and when you destroy the state, you lose the army, half those guys will go join the Islamic State. Who's going to put the boots on the ground? We're not going to send boots on the ground. Russia. Some special ops. Is the United States going to put boots on the ground? No. If we don't have the Syrian army fighting, who's going to do the fighting? Answer that question, Putin says, over and over and over again. And our answer is, well, but you're bolstering Assad. And his answer is, no, we're saving the Syrian state. We don't care about Assad down the road. We need the Syrian state. And to end this story, it is a fact that the Islamic State was pumping oil out of Syria and shipping it to Turkey for years and funding the army. And the Russians repeatedly showed our intel, look at the pictures. Take those trucks out. And we did nothing. And then in September 2015, the Russian Air Force came in and decimated that supply line that was funding the Islamic State. Is that apologetics for Putin? No. That's an apologetics for American national security. So the bottom line is, and let me remind you, the Russians talk about mistrust. The Russians told the FBI and the CIA in Moscow and then again in Washington, about the Tsarnaev brother. You remember the guy who blew the Boston Marathon? What did the FBI do? They sent somebody to his mother, and she said he's a wonderful boy. And they said, okay, did they surveil him? No. Did they tap him? No. Did they follow him to the hardware store where he and his brother were buying the stuff to build the bomb? No. Russian intelligence, however malevolent can be, really knows this world because they're part of it. How many Islamic citizens does Russia have? About 17 million, roughly?
About
15?
20.
20. Well, they breed faster than Russians, right? That's part of the problem. No, that's part of the problem. It's not a joke. So Russia's part of this world. Their intelligence, they got more embedded agents in these terrorists. And it's good that there are all these Russians fighting there because half of them are, some percentage of them are informers. We need Russian intelligence to protect us.
Thank you.
And we need a Syrian state that can fight unless you guys feel we should send Americans over there to do it. We're talking 40, 50,000 Americans.
Thank you, Professor.
It's going to happen.
I'm trying to feel protected. Julia, please jump in.
So let's work backwards through that. First of all, I shouldn't have wasted time telling you guys about the Russian perspective. You have it here. No, I mean, it's a very clear, concise summary of what you'll hear in official Russian circles. It's this, these are the arguments that Russians will put forward. About the Tsarnaev brothers, yes, the FSB did tip off the FBI about the Tsarnaev brothers. The problem is that they lived in America, which has laws very different than the Russian Federation, where you can't just tap somebody's phone and you can't just follow them to the hardware store. And these, unfortunately, are just some of the risks.
Here or there, you mean?
Here.
We have different laws.
We do have different laws.
We can't tap phones.
I'm saying there are procedures to tap phones.
I know, but we don't tap phones here.
That's not what I said.
They could have.
That's not what I said. Let me finish. I didn't interrupt you.
I know,
Okay.
but they could have gotten a tap.
The point is, also, the Russians aren't that great at dealing with terrorism. For a long time, the way they dealt with terrorism domestically was so harsh and so ham-fisted and sledgehammer. It was the sledgehammer approach that bred more and more terrorism. There's a reason. It's not just the large Muslim population of Russia that there are so many people fighting in Syria. The other question is, I just fundamentally don't agree that ISIS is the biggest threat to the U.S. If anything, Russia's a far, far bigger threat to the U.S. What is ISIS going to do? They're going to kill a few dozen people here and a few dozen people there? That's horrible, but they don't have nuclear weapons like Russia. They don't have a massive ground army like Russia. They don't have an air force. They don't have, like, fundamentally, Russia is an existential threat to the U.S., not ISIS. ISIS is not, and never has been, and never will be an existential threat to the U.S. And when you... when was this?
I think I deserve a moment of personal privilege.
Of course,
of personal courtesy. Is that what they say at the Senate? When I said this is the way the Russian political class thinks about Syria and statehood, I said it was also my view. Julia, but she half took it back, said, well, I don't have to tell you what the Russians think because Cohen just told you, and you all laughed, as though I represent the Russian point of view. This is part of the problem with the dialogue in this country. 85% of what Andrew and Julia say, I don't believe to be factually correct. And I'm not going to sort of pick guerrilla wars with them on each point. But because an American who has some credentials, and I'm far from alone, and there are people in the agency who think exactly the way I do, exactly the way I do. There's no collective CIA. When I tell you that the Russian analysis of the Syrian situation is correct, and decapitating states endangers us, I agree, not because Putin says it. I don't care what Putin says, but I'm glad he does because they think he's right. I'm speaking to American. So it's not a good thing to say, oh, that's the Russian or Soviet point of view. When Reagan decided to accept some of Gorbachev's way of thinking about the world, he was attacked for accepting a Soviet point of view? And he said, yes, I do accept it. I'm convinced that's right, but we have our points of view. So we should stop this in this country, that anybody who says something that you disagree with, to say it's the Russian point of view. The Russians can be right. My bottom line is this. Any doctors in the room? Physicians? Good. So, Julia, who's a journalist, Steve, who's a scholar, teacher, whatever, and our physicians have one thing in common. We get our facts wrong and we malpractice. What's the first oath of the physician? Do no harm. So if I come to you, you get your diagnosis right before you cut me, right? All right. The same thing for journalists. If they don't have their facts right, they're malpracticing. If I don't have my facts wrong, I'm teaching my students fake news. So if the facts aren't there, it's not for me. That's my bottom line. I think much of what they've said, there's no facts for. For example, and I'll stop here, I think there's zero facts that the Russians hacked the DNC. And yet Andrew's going on about how they hacked our democracy. Maybe they did, but nobody's produced the facts yet. When we get the facts, then we'll figure this out. But many people have told us it didn't happen.
Well, Professor,
experts.
Thank you. Let's turn to that. Thank you. So, Julia, you've written and spoken. I'm going to sort of back into this question. Mm-hmm. You've written and spoken of the logic of Russian meddling in the U.S. and other Western elections. On the Atlantic website.
Maybe we should focus on facts below the threshold of hacking and look at what's happening in Europe. And it's open and it's into your face. There is a war in media on European liberal democracy model, and there is an open support for all forces who are against European Union and against liberal agenda of parties. The German Alternative for Germany, the youth organization, has an alliance with the youth organization of Putin party. Marine Le Pen got the credits. Nobody even denies it. You yourself are always on Russia Today, which is is an out into your face, a hatred campaign against the West, the United States, and Europe. So how do you deal with this? I hope I did not malpractice now, but I'm sure about my facts. So how do you deal with these facts, and how it's not about hacking, it's about into your face propaganda.
Professor, thank you.
Anybody know why Jews have such short necks? I mean, this guy says he doesn't malpractice. If we're going to do facts, Andrew's wrong. German intelligence, at Merkel's request, did an investigation of whether or not Russia was unduly interfering in German politics. Unduly meaning... You're going to ask your question and answer it?
Well, you don't answer my question.
I'm trying. And unduly means, and we should all ask this, are the Russians doing anything that we don't do and haven't done for years, and they haven't done for years? I mean, are we all born yesterday? I mean, we've been meddling in Russia's political process and elections. I don't even know what meddle means anymore. If Andrew means that they do broadcasts as RT, that are subversive out of their Washington bureau, I mean, which the three intelligence agencies, and Brennan admitted, and so did Clapper, it wasn't 17, it was 3, and they handpicked the analysis to cook that report they published in January. And Andrew says now, well, they can't tell us everything because it's classified. That's what they told John Kennedy when they asked him why the Bay of Pigs went wrong. And they asked Johnson when they told him why Tonkin went wrong. And what they told us when it turned out Saddam didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. I mean, this is a long story. Do we have to be born yesterday? Can we bring to this some discussion? So, when Comey testifies, when is it, Thursday? Somebody please ask him, because there are no forensics, Andrew, why the FBI didn't do the forensics on the DNC computer, but allowed Clinton to say, no, we've got our own organization called CrowdStrike. Now, I live in New York City. That would be like there's a mass murder in New York City, and the New York Police Department hires a private dick to do the investigation. Why didn't Comey do the forensics? It's a simple question. There are no forensics because CrowdStrike's report has fallen apart. Jeffrey Carr, maybe our #1 computer expert, who hates both Putin and Trump, said something very smart. If all signs point to Russia, Russia didn't do it. Expert hackers don't leave fingerprints. Andrew says they left a fingerprint. They left the name Dzerzhinsky. You know who Dzerzhinsky was? He was the founder of the Soviet secret police. And yet we're told these are super hackers. Oh, but they left their wallet there with their ID card in it. This is bunk. We want facts. We want facts.
Professor,
one last point. For Julia, and you know, everybody, some people think abortion's the #1 essential threat to the world. Some people think climate change is the #1 essential threat. We all have a #1 essential threat. For me, it's international terrorism, because I remember 9/11. Have we all forgotten that? I know we have subways we can't protect. Maybe we could protect the planes now, but we can't protect our ports. We can't protect our trains. We can't protect our sports and rock arenas. We cannot do that. And here's the point. These guys, Julia says they don't have any nukes. These guys are desperately in search of radioactive material. The French police thought they were close in France. Radioactive material is all over the world. There's too much of it around the former Soviet states. If they get radioactive material and they put it in an explosive at Yankee Stadium, you won't be able to go to that area for a decade. If there had been radioactive material at the Twin Towers, the whole of lower Manhattan would not be inhabitable today. This is a new terrorism, and once they get this stuff and they're ready to attach it to their explosives, so for me that's existential.
Professor, thank you.
She agrees with Senator McCain that Russia's #1. To me, this is myopic folly, but this is what we should debate.